The 18th century is often referred to as the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment. And I want to spend a few minutes explaining why those titles fit. We talked earlier when we were studying the Baroque period how that scientific revolution was taking place in the 17th century. This scientific revolution that really started in 1500 and lasted through 1700 saw European scientists using reason to make important scientific discoveries. Discoveries about planetary movements. We know that's what got Galileo in trouble. We know the thermometer and the barometer were invented during the 17th century, as well as a vaccine for smallpox and things of that nature. In the early 1700s, people started asking the question, if people used reason to find laws that govern the physical world, why not use reason in all other areas of life? So this is where you get this idea of the age of reason, the age of people being enlightened. And so we're going to look first at literature, then political philosophy, and then later on music to see how people are using reason to produce these different art forms, as well as using reason to create new political philosophy. 18th century writers believed that literature should do some very important things. One, it should engage the audience's reason. It should engage current events, and it should instruct. Now, there was an underlying assumption that literature should also entertain. But do you see how these three things, engaging the audience's reason, engage current events, and instruct, all are not necessarily entertaining pursuits? So literature's job was to connect with a person's reason and to connect that individual reason to what was happening in the world around the reader. Some major 18th century literary genres: essays, poetry, plays, satires, translations, all of these genres had been sort of in vogue for centuries and centuries. They'd been there, they'd been active. The new genre on the scene in the 18th century was the novel. You get the birth of the novel in the 18th century, where people focus on real life people doing real life things, having real life problems in a world that they're trying desperately to understand and find their place in. So if you want to know when the novel started, it started in the 18th century. I want to back up a little bit to a 17th century poet because it's important to understand that what John Dryden contributed to the poetry of the 18th century. John Dryden was an English poet who was very conscious of his public. He knew who he was writing for, and he wanted to please them. He held a minor post in Oliver Cromwell's government in the 17th century. Oliver Cromwell led the English Revolution in the latter part of the 17th century. He succeeded for a while in overthrowing the monarch and establishing a more democratic form of government. And while Cromwell was governing England, John Dryden held a position in this new revolutionary government. So in 1658, we get John Dryden's poem, The Heroic Stanzas to the Glorious Memory of Oliver, where he is praising and lauding Oliver Cromwell. Remember, these guys felt it incumbent upon them to connect with their public and to connect their public with current events. So he definitely did that. In 1660, he published a piece called Astrea Redux, when he praises, in other words, the king. So he sort of goes back and forth in his poetry depending upon the political climate. He wasn't a dumb man at all. In 1664, he became a very successful dramatist in the newly chartered theaters. During Cromwell's rule, he shut down all the theaters. He thought that they were sinful and caused people to do really bad things. But when the monarchy was restored, came back into power in 1660, the theaters were opened again, and John Dryden began writing plays. Again, with the same sort of consciousness of world events, or English events for that matter, and who his public was, and trying to educate them. And actually in 1668, John Dryden became the Poet Laureate of England. This is what John Dryden believed poetry should do. And he believed, again, and this should be familiar, it should be written for public occasions, written to inform or instruct, and to appeal to the reason of the audience. He believed poetry should be an easy and natural style, nothing stilted. And this is what he thinks an ideal poet, the characteristics an ideal poet should have. Look, he should be reasonable, philosophical, and in some measure mathematical. So do you see how reasonable, philosophical, and mathematical, those are all ideas that you don't necessarily always associate with creativity, but Dryden said they were very important. And indeed, if you look at poetry of the 18th century, it is typically written in heroic couplets, very rhymed, very orderly, certain feet, certain meter, very mathematically precise. He believed that an excellent poet should have great experience with people, that he should be skilled in conversation, and should have a great knowledge of mankind and the world around him. So in other words, the poet needs to be a reasonable person with a mathematical bent that can explain the world. Another poet, famous poet of the 18th century, was a man named Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope translated a lot of the Greek classics. Sometimes you will hear the 18th century referred to as the neoclassical period. And this is one of the reasons why. They took a great interest in the classical past, of looking back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the ideas of the classical ideal, that life should be balanced, there should be order, there should be proportion, that man can make order out of his chaotic world. And so one of the things that these poets did was to translate the Greek classics. Pope, like other writers of the 18th century, valued order and reason. He was a satirist. One of his most famous satires was The Rape of the Lock, which just makes fun of a nobleman clipping a lock of hair from a noble woman, and he makes much ado about this lock of hair going up into the heavens and blah blah blah, sort of making fun of the nobility and their vanity. And one of his sort of most famous non-dramatic works, poetic works, is called An Essay on Man. And An Essay on Man is a pretty lengthy poem, and in it Pope discusses what is the proper purpose and end of man. He slams man's pridefulness. He says men are prideful and they shouldn't be. He urges humanity to be content wherever they are in life. And he believed in the concept of the great chain of being, with God being at the top, then angels, then men, then animals, then plants, and finally on down to rocks. And so in bringing out this idea of the great chain of being, he reminds man that there is a God, but that man isn't it. He reminds man that, hey, you're not God, but you're not an animal either. So you need to act not as an animal. You need to exercise your reason and your rationality, but you don't need to be prideful and think you are God. So again, you see Pope trying to strike a balance there. As with the literature, and as you will see later with the music, every socio-political problem the 18th century folks believed could be solved through the use of reason. Politically, they believed that governments were created to secure an orderly society, and that the separation of powers is the best way to protect human liberties, that all are created free and equal, and that a free market should be allowed to regulate trade. Now, these should be very familiar beliefs to you, because this political philosophy of the 18th century is what our country was founded on, these beliefs. John Locke, who we mentioned earlier when we were talking about 17th century political philosophers, is probably the most influential single person in helping to create the ideas of America and what American government would look like. Thomas Jefferson was very much a student of John Locke. And as he sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, he was very familiar with the beliefs of Locke. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the beliefs of John Locke. And then, and again, we've looked at these before. Humans are naturally reasonable and have natural rights that no one can take away, that no one gave to them, that they were God-given, life, liberty, and property, and that people form governments only to protect these rights. And the best government is one with limited power that only focuses on protecting those rights. And again, if a government violates those rights, people have the right to overthrow the government. Well, you can see all of those ideas echoed in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence begins with what you see on the right. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is about the second paragraph of the Declaration. All men are created equal. Again, that looks like Locke, right? And that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable or natural rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So you can see how much that echoes what Locke believed. Later on in the Declaration, Jefferson deals with this last item here, where, and basically says almost those same words. When a government violates those rights or becomes burdensome, people have the right to overthrow the government. In the French Revolution as well, you can see some of the same ideas echoed. The French played a very, very big role in American independence. Benjamin Franklin spent a lot of time in France trying to get French support for the revolutionary cause, and he succeeded. And one of the reasons that we won the Revolutionary War was because Lafayette, a French general, really helped Washington at Yorktown, one of the final battles of the Revolutionary War. And so the French played a big role, and they were very interested in the revolutionary ideas of America. So in 1789, the French Revolution began, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, you can see the parallels with Locke and with Jefferson. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and inalienable rights of man. These are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The source of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No group, no individual may exercise authority not emanating expressly therefrom. So these ideas not only that sort of were floating around in the 17th century really took hold in the 18th and created revolution not only in England but in America and in France.